Hi there, my name is Caitlin Bandy and this is my channel Bandy's Books, and today we are here to do a July reading wrap up. Let me just tell you straight off the bat, July was possibly the best month of the year. If the year continues as is, then July is going to be a standout by far. I have so many 4 and 5 star reads to talk about this month. Very few 3 stars and no 2 stars at all. So I am absolutely stoked to talk to you about what I read. Before we dive into the books, if you're as excited to hear about the 4 and 5 star reads as I am to talk about them, make sure you smash the thumbs up button and comment down below and let me know how your reading month was in July. So first of all, let's get into some statistics. I read 29 books in the month of July. That breaks down to 8,723 pages, or 300 pages per book on average. In terms of the page number range, 45% of my reads this month were under 300 pages. 48% of my reads were between 300 to 500 pages, and 7% of my reads were above 500 pages. For fiction versus nonfiction, 31% or 9 of my books were nonfiction reads, and 69% or 20 of my books were fiction reads. My top 5 genres this month were literary fiction, historical fiction, LGBTQIA, historical nonfiction, and race. My shortest read of the month was Notes on Grief by Chimamanda Ngozie Adichie. This was 67 pages. My longest read of the month was Built from Fire by Victor Luckerson. This came in at 692 pages. Now with all that out of the way, we're gonna go ahead and jump into how I rated each one of these books. I'm gonna be starting with 3 stars this month and working my way all the way up to the 5 stars. Right there. The first of my 3-star reads was Lapvona by Otessa Moshfegh. This was a book that I was really hoping I would love. I read My Year of Rest and Relaxation in June for the Backlist Book Club, and I really enjoyed that one. It was a solid 4-star for me. I thought that this would be one of those books that just was like a searing critique. It's described as satirical, kind of edgy, subversive, and really, honestly, this just fell really flat for me. There was only 1 or 2 characters that I found really interesting. Most of the people within this book seemed like caricatures, but not in the type of way where you're like making a caricature to critique someone or something. It just, overall, I didn't really get the point of the book. Maybe this was too smart for me, but I actually think that this was just a case of it not working all the way. The next of my 3-star reads is going to be somewhat controversial, and this is because it is a classic and it is usually a pretty well-loved classic, but I have a complex relationship with classics. And while I understand that this particular book was like cutting-edge literary at the time, for a modern day reader, I don't think it's all that great. And that is The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn by Mark Twain. So this was a book that I remember reading as a kid at some point, maybe for school, and I think I liked it okay at the time. As an adult reading this, I felt like this was overly simplistic, and I get that the book is told through the point of view of a young person, so maybe he sees the world in an overly simplistic way. But for me, it just feels like something is missing in this narrative. I wanted Huck to really kind of get the bigger picture and how messed up some of the things are that are going on around him. Now, I get the time period. People will argue, well, Caitlin, that was just what it was like at the time. I understand, but I'm not from that time period. I'm reading it as a modern reader. And to me, I don't know that this holds up, especially when I compare it to James by Percival Everett, which we'll be talking about later in this video. Then I read Morning and Evening by John Fosse. This is a book that I received through NetGalley, and I was really excited to see Fosse's work listed for an ARC copy. He's an author that I'm familiar with, but I have never read before, and I hear amazing things about his writing, so I thought I'd give it a try. Morning and Evening centers on an older gentleman, and he is coming to the end of his life. He has kind of sort of given up. He is not really trying to socialize with anyone. His kids live far away. His wife is dead. And really this book is just about like the mundane things that go on during his day. His dry stale bread that he eats with butter and his tea. And he kind of like points out he's not really enjoying it. There's nothing about it that he feels enthusiastic about. He just eats it because he knows he has to have something in his system. And we spend most of the book inside of his head just reflecting on these little mundane things until the very end, and it twists a bit, and then the book makes a lot more sense. For me, this is one of those cases of really quiet, prosy writing that's really beautiful but doesn't actually say a whole lot. We have just an ordinary day in an ordinary man's life. We don't get any of his backstory. We don't get a ton of lead up to who he is or how he became the way he is. And the ending where it kind of gives us a little bit of a twist to add some impact to the story, wasn't enough for me to make this book feel really exciting. Would I consider reading Fosse again? Yes. The writing was really lovely, and I do sometimes like character-driven stories. I just think in this case, there was nothing particularly special about the character we were centered on. Next up is Grown Ups by Maria Aubert. So this is a book that was recommended to me by La Playa Books in San Diego around Christmas last year. The person recommending it described this as really humorous and bitchy and like a character who just says what she means, and it was just a really fast, fun read. Unfortunately, I feel like that description did not match what this book actually is. I went into it thinking it was going to be funny, that it was going to be lighthearted, that yeah, maybe the character was going to be very direct and borderline bitchy, but what I got instead was a character that I just frankly could not stand. I have read and enjoyed unlikable characters, but this character was unlikable in a way that was hard for me to tolerate. I pushed through this book because it was indeed a fast, short read, but I didn't really enjoy it. We have a character who basically does not care about anyone but herself. She is incapable of seeing anyone else's perspective, incapable of empathizing with anyone, and she does some morally reprehensible things, and she doesn't understand why people get upset when she does them. There's just a really big disconnect with this character and the types of characters that I like to read. Other people may find this more enjoyable. I don't think it was a badly written book, but it wasn't for me. I will add that this is translated fiction, so I don't know if something was lost in translation, but for me, it just seemed like I just wasn't gonna vibe with this book. And the last of my 3-star reads was Whale Fall by Elizabeth O'Connor. So this book is set on an Welsh island. We have a young woman who is kind of coming of age in a society where women are supposed to get married and, you know, tend to the farm and the kids and things like that. And then some scientists from the mainland come out to the island and they are researching the population and this whale that beached on the shore of the island. What ends up happening is our young character is exposed to the idea that women can go get an education, that they can be more than mothers and more than housekeepers. And she really wants to go back to the mainland. Eventually, our character is forced to realize that the mainlanders don't have the highest opinion of the people living on the island. In fact, it's very condescending and patronizing. You can see that she's very conflicted about this. So there were some things that I really liked about this book. I think the thing that's particularly interesting about this book is that this experience that this girl has with these scientists and the perception of society of this little island would fit in so many places in the world. Anywhere where you have a rural society that's a little bit cut off from modern technology, I think might have experiences like this when outsiders are coming in to visit. I thought that that was captured really well. The problem with the book for me is that I wanted more. I wanted it to delve deeper. I wanted it to say more complex things than it did, and I feel like it just fell a little bit short in the messaging. Not a bad book, and I would definitely read O'Connor's writing again. Now we're gonna move into my 4-star reads, and let me tell you, I have 12 of them, so we've got a lot to talk about. These were some fantastic books. They weren't quite perfect, but they definitely would do the trick. First up, I had Notes on Grief by Chimamanda Ngozie Adichie. So this is a short meditation on Adichie's father dying. He is this well-respected man in the community and in Adichie's life. You can tell just how much she loves and looks up to him. And she talks about his passing, the way that she was separated from her family when it happened, and the way the community comes together to mourn a loss. I thought that this was a really beautiful book, and I thought that the meditations could be really poignant. I just wish that it had delved a little deeper. This is only 67 pages long, so it's a very short read, and you can see that the size of the book is like the size of my hand. So they're not even 67 full pages. Again, it had some moments that were super poignant, but I feel like had she delved a little deeper into that experience and what grief is like, it could have been an even more poignant read. My next 4-star read is Interesting Facts About Space by Emily Austen. So this is a book that I was unsure if I was gonna like. It has one of those quirky summaries where you're like, this book could be either really, really out there, or it could be a book I really love. And I'm leaning towards I really enjoyed this book. We have a character named Enid who is very quirky. She knows all of the facts there are about space, and she shares them with her mother whenever she feels like it. She has a deep-seated fear of bald men, but she can't figure out why. She feels like someone's stalking her, but she's having a hard time proving it. And she is really struggling to kind of fit the puzzle pieces of her life together. Enid was a character that was hard for me to get into initially. The first few chapters of this story were jarring, but once I kind of got an idea of who she was and where things were going, I really started to enjoy being inside of her head. Enid is a very unique person dealing with complex post-traumatic stress disorder, and I thought the way that Austen handled her neurodivergence and the trauma that she's been through was very thoughtfully done. Overall, there are a few things within this book that I thought were a little far out there, but for the most part, I really enjoyed the read. I did find the ending just a little bit rushed, and I wish that just a few more pages had been dedicated to giving us space to come to terms with everything that happened to Enid in the end. After that, I had Goodnight, Irene by Luis Alberto Urrea. So this is a story about the donut dollies in World War II. If you're unfamiliar with what a donut dolly is, they were women who served through the Red Cross, and basically they would roll around in tanks and they would make coffee and donuts for the soldiers serving on the front line. Now, originally, they were basically designed to give soldiers a taste of home, flirt with them, have good conversations with them, basically help them to decompress from the horrors that they were seeing. But so many of these women were forced into positions where they had to provide emergency medical care despite not being medical professionals, had to see combat despite not being soldiers, and basically had to be therapists despite not having psychiatry or psychology degrees. These women really ended up serving a much more significant role than simply making donuts and coffee. The two women that this book focuses on are some badass ladies. I really appreciated the two perspectives that we see throughout this story. And despite this being about World War II and some really horrific things, there are a lot of moments of levity within this story as well. I thought Urrea did a really beautiful job of balancing like very horrific scenes with some really fun ones as well. I found it really realistic that in between these horrific scenes, people have to decompress. People still have like their gallows sense of humor. And I thought that really came through well within this book. This was my first time reading Urrea, but I am a fan and I would absolutely consider reading his books again, particularly if they're in the historical fiction genre. One thing I want to point out too is I love that the front of this book has all these pictures of actual donut dollies here. Next up is Wayward by Amelia Hart. So in 2023, this book was nominated for Book of the Month, Book of the Year. This was the only book that was nominated for Book of the Year that I hadn't read and actually wanted to read. So this was my pick for my free book. I have heard nothing but good reviews of this book. It was one that I was really hyped to read. And for the most part, I think it was a successful read for me. This has 3 timelines following 3 different women. All 3 of them are connected by blood, and all 3 of them exhibit an unusual power over elements of nature. This is historical fiction with that sprinkling of magical realism, fantasy, and those are all things that I really love, especially because this book centers on a bunch of tough, strong women. So all of them have this control of nature, and odd things tend to happen around them, and that leads to accusations of witchcraft and a variety of other things happening. I thought that this book overall was really good. I wish that I got a little bit more explanation of the magical realism fantasy element, but I did think that each story was compelling for the most part. I did like the older 2 storylines better than the most modern storyline. And I feel like every time I read books that have multiple POVs, there's always ones that shine and ones that are like a little less strong. And that was the case here. Overall, I thought this was a really enjoyable read. If you like historical fiction, if you like magical realism, if you like badass women, I think that you will probably enjoy this book. Then I have Floating in a Most Peculiar Way by Luis Chudesoke. So this is Luis's memoir of his childhood, and wow, he had such an interesting life. So his father was the leader of the Biafran Revolution in Nigeria, and his mother is originally from Jamaica, grew up in England, and then married this man who led the Biafran War. When Biafra lost, his mother and him fled, and his father was executed. So Luis's childhood starts in Jamaica. It's really interesting because while Luis is really well cared for and he has lots of friends and people around him in Jamaica, he's constantly reminded that he is not actually Jamaican himself, that he is instead African. And then eventually he gets moved to the United States where his mother is, and they're initially in Washington, D.C., and they later move to Inglewood, Los Angeles. And the same thing, when he lives in Los Angeles, he's frequently reminded that he is not a Black American, that he is African, he's Jamaican, but he's not from here. I thought that this book really excellently conveyed the story of many immigrants, of being stuck between 2 cultures, never really fitting in anywhere. And in this case, Luis is actually stuck between 3 different cultures. There is his African heritage, Jamaica where he grew up, and the United States where he is currently living. I thought that thought that was probably the most interesting part of this book. I also really appreciated the discussion of the Biafran Revolution. This is something that I honestly knew nothing about. I don't think that I've ever read a book that discussed this topic, and I don't honestly remember ever hearing about this, but this was a relatively recent conflict. And so that actually thrust me down a rabbit hole of doing some reading about it. The reason that this memoir is a 4-star instead of a 5-star is because there were definitely some areas where I wanted Luis to go into more depth. I think his story is fascinating. I think there are so many different things he could talk about, but I feel like we just got a brief summary. I wanted it to delve just so much deeper. This is overall a really enjoyable narrative. If you're interested in immigrant stories, this is a particularly good one. And if you're interested in learning a bit more about Biafra and Nigeria, this is also a really good read for that. From there, I have Bolla by Pajtim Statovci. So this is a book that is set in 1995 Kosovo. We have 2 male characters. One is Albanian and one is Serbian. And they start a love affair despite the many complications of this potential relationship. Our Albanian character has a wife who's pregnant with his first child at home waiting for him. But the 2 men are drawn to each other like a moth to the flame. They cannot resist despite the conflict, the danger, the pressures of home life, everything that is going on around them. They still start this affair. This is not an easy read. There are a lot of potentially triggering things discussed in this book. It goes to some really dark and depressing places. What I thought it did really well is convey what illicit affairs can be like and why people get drawn into them. I thought that it conveyed the sense of this time and place really well. So 1995 Kosovo, there is a conflict going on, and there's this like pressing feeling of wrongness throughout the story of the potential danger that all of our characters are trying to avoid throughout. The reason that this book was a 4-star instead of a 5-star is because one of the characters is so hard to like, and he's even harder to understand. I don't mind a character that's unlikable, but I have to understand why the character is doing what they're doing. And honestly, a lot of the times in this book, I did not understand this particular character. There are definitely some things that I did not understand within this book, and I think that just has something to do with Statovci's writing style. This is the second book that I've read by him. His other book, My Cat Yugoslavia, was a book that I read for a book club, and I had a harder time understanding that one. There was definitely stuff that went over my head in that one. This one was a little bit clearer for me, but I still feel like I might be missing 1 or 2 things here or there. Overall, I think that this was a pretty decent read, and if you're particularly interested in the Bosnia-Herzegovina conflict, this might be a good book for you. Then I read The Husband by Holly Gramazio. So this is a book that I was hoping would be a more lighthearted read. With all the heavy topics on my TBR, I just wanted something that might be a little bit more fun. This is about a woman who comes home one day. She's gone out partying, she's kind of drunk, and she finds a husband in her house. The problem is she never had a husband previously. And then after a series of coincidental experiences, she finds out that her addict is what's producing these random husbands. And every time she gets tired of one, she asks him to go upstairs into the attic and get something out, and then they disappear and a new husband pops out. Sounds like a great concept for a lot of fun and laughs. This book, I think, starts off really well. I think the initial handful of husbands are fun and quirky and interesting, and it makes for a great story. I think where this book went off the rails for me is that it overdoes it. We go through more husbands than we ever needed to go through, and it starts to feel a little bit tedious around maybe the 2/3 way. Then we get to the ending, and I felt like the ending was so rushed. I felt like Gramazio spent more time on the husbands at the beginning than she did at the very end, at the conclusion of the story. And that's the person I felt like I wanted to know more about. So I think that this book needed better editing. I think that maybe Gramazio needed to sit with her concept and be a little bit more restrained. I think I've mentioned this in reviews before, but sometimes when you're writing a book, you don't need to include every single idea that you've had on your entire list. Sometimes you go, oh, let me pick the 3 to 5 best ideas, and that makes a stunning book because that restraint allows those ideas to shine a little bit more. I just feel like this was a really fun concept, and I did overall enjoy the book, but I think it just needed a little bit more restraint. Then I had Orbital by Samantha Harvey. So I mentioned when I was talking about John Fosse's book, Morning and Evening, that it was the type of book that was quiet and reflective and not really about anything in particular. And that's how Orbital is too. We have a group of people on a spaceship and they are orbiting Earth, and it's just their day-to-day reflections on what is going on around them. But because they're in a spaceship orbiting Earth, those reflections are actually interesting. The writing within Orbital is also really lovely. Harvey's prose is beautiful, and this is almost like poetry as you read it. It's a short book, quick and easy, and while nothing like plot-wise happens, I still found it to be a pretty interesting read. If you like quiet, reflective books with beautiful prose, this is definitely one you should pick up. Next up, I have The Wager by David Grann. This is a nonfiction book about a shipwreck, mutiny, and murder. This was a really interesting read. This is a story that I was unfamiliar with, but it is the story of the ship The Wager that is on its way to the tip of South America to Patagonia when it wrecks. A while later, an improvised flotation device shows up off the coast of Brazil carrying 30 men, and they go on living their life. That is until a second improvised flotation device shows up, and the 3 men on that device say that those previous 30 men were mutineers. There's this whole he said situation going on, and the case is just wild. This is a super interesting and compelling read. I think the only reason that I put it in the 4-star category instead of the 5-star category is that I felt a little bit emotionally disconnected from this book. It was fascinating, it was action, it was adventure, but I never felt like I really got to know any of the characters super deeply, and I just felt a bit of a disconnect. Maybe people that are a little more into swashbuckling sea adventure stories will appreciate it more than I did. Don't get me wrong, it is a really good read, and I would say that this is actually probably more of a 4.5 than a straight 4. Definitely worth picking up. After that, I had Mirrored Heavens by Rebecca Roanhorse. So this was one of my most anticipated reads for 2024. This is the end of the Between the Earth and Sky trilogy, the first book of which was Black Sun, second book was Fevered Star, and now we have Mirrored Heavens. I could not wait to see how this series was going to end, and for the most part, I'm pretty happy with the conclusion. I don't want to discuss this book in super great detail just because I don't want to spoil the series for anyone that might be interested in reading it. I will say that my favorite character in the whole entire series gets a lot more face time in this particular book. I liked the way that several of the main characters' arcs were resolved. I will say that there was some stuff that felt a little bit jarring to me, a few characterization changes that maybe didn't feel all the way accurate, but overall I was pretty happy with how the story wrapped up. I do wish that there had been a little bit more action within this book. I feel like books 1 and 2 were much more fast and actiony, and I think book 3 kind of slowed down and delved more into the internal thoughts of some of the characters. I didn't dislike it, but I did find myself missing some of the action from the previous books. Overall, I'm satisfied with the whole entire arc of the story. It's definitely not the strongest ending that I've ever read, but it's not the worst either. And I would say that I still really enjoyed this series as a whole. The last of my 4-star reads is Trust by Hernan Diaz. So this is a book that I buddy read with Jamie Kate. She and I have been working together to move some books off of our bookshelves. We've been either picking books that are like the longest ones that we kind of tend to push off in favor of shorter books, or the books that have been sitting on our shelves for the longest time. And recently we got into a discussion of books we wanted to get to, and Trust came up, and I was like, oh, hey, I have a copy of that book too. And so we decided we would buddy read it. This is a book that I was not sure I was gonna like. I've heard very mixed reviews of it, and so I was a little bit skeptical going in. And I have to say I was pleasantly surprised. The first half of this book is a little bit difficult. There are moments where it feels overly pretentious, but overall I enjoyed the story, and as I got through that like very pretentious beginning, I felt like I really started to enjoy the writing and what was happening. I felt like oddly that pretentiousness kind of really fit with the focal point character at the beginning of the story, and that in the second part of the story, when the focal point character changes, we get a more down-to-earth narrative because that's who that focal point character is. So I guess in reflecting on the entirety of the book, like the way that the story is told in each section really makes sense for who we're focusing on. This is a really interesting book. It has some Wall Street capitalistic messaging. It has a mystery in the center of it. It has a person whose loyalties are torn between two different things. There's just a lot going on, and I feel like I thought this was pretty enjoyable. In fact, reflecting on some of the reviews that were not so positive about this, I'm not sure what it was that people didn't like. Maybe it was that first half of the book that kind of seemed like it dragged a little bit. But overall, I think this is a fairly strong read. I definitely think it's better than I expected. And now we're jumping into my 5-star reads. Guys, I have 11 5-star reads this month. That is insane. I think in the entirety of my YouTube channel, I can't remember a month where I've had that many 5-star reads. Seriously, this month was phenomenally good. I am not lying to you when I say this is maybe the best reading month that I have had, at least this year, and possibly in the entirety of this channel. So let's jump into those 5-star reads because we still have a lot to talk about. First up is Antibot by Sierra Greer. This is a book that blew my mind. I absolutely loved this. I have read a lot of books that talk about AI, that present scenarios where AIs gain sentience or intelligence, all sorts of scenarios around technology. And yet this one was so fresh, so interesting. I love the way that this discussed sentience, bodily autonomy, gender violence, so many deep themes. This book is just brilliantly written. I'm 99% certain that this book is going to show up in my top 24 of 2024. So this book focuses on a character named Annie, who is an AI, and she is designed as an autodidactic bunny model, which means that she is supposed to be a personal companion to her owner. Her whole goal in life is to please him. She dresses to please him. She responds to his desire to please him. Everything is about him. And then she starts to gain sentience and develop a personality and thought. And it's really interesting where that goes. She almost becomes a real human in some sense. And that causes a lot of problems because as she becomes more sentient, she starts to push back on her defined role, and that displeases her master. And she feels a conflict with this internal programming that makes her uncomfortable with his displeasure. About halfway through this book, something happened, which I won't discuss here, but it made me really scared about where this book was gonna go. I was like, oh my gosh, this book has been so good so far. Please don't fumble it at the end. And I just dreaded for a little while as I was reading that this author might fumble it, but it was all for nothing because the ending was perfect. I love the way that this author ended this book. I can't think of a better ending for it. This book was fantastic. It is a short read. I gobbled it up. Every time that I sat down to read it, I read it in like 70 to 90 page chunks until it was finished. If you take one recommendation from me this year, pick this book up. Next in my 5-star reads was Built from the Fire, the epic story of Tulsa's Greenwood District, America's Black Wall Street by Victor Luckerson. So this is a book that is about Tulsa's Greenwood District, or what has been referred to as Black Wall Street. And this spans so much time. It talks about the Tulsa race riots, it talks about gentrification, all of the obstacles that the people and the business owners in this particular area had to go through. This is a poignant and moving book. It talks about so many interesting points in history. I obviously know about the Tulsa race riots and Tulsa massacre, but I did not know much of this history aside from that. And so this was a huge learning experience for me. Just a fascinating book. I love in particular the sections where they're talking about gentrification and eminent domain and how that affected this particular neighborhood. This was a book that just kept me learning one thing after the other and has sent me down another rabbit hole since reading it. If you're interested in American history, particularly Black history, I think that this is a must read. Next up is a book that's going to come as a surprise to no one because pretty much everybody is universally rating this book as 5 stars, and I'm just here to add my voice to the chorus of love. This was recently longlisted for the Booker Prize, and I can absolutely see why. And that is James by Percival Everett. So if you're watching the entirety of this video, you would have seen in my 3 stars when I talked about Huck Finn, how I said that Huck Finn paled in comparison to James. In Huck Finn, we have the story told through the eyes of a young white boy who does not pick up on all of the things that are happening, all of the levels of nuance and danger surrounding the characters of the story. But in James, we see that exact same story told through the eyes of an older Black man who has been a slave and understands very well all of the potential dangers around him. This book is so much more thoughtful, so much more nuanced, so much more layered. It delves into so many deep topics. This is just brilliantly done. It was my first time reading Percival Everett, and I am definitely a fan now. I am definitely going to be checking out his backlist. What I really love in this book is that James is a full character instead of a caricature. In Huck Finn, he's Jim, and he's portrayed a certain type of way. But in James, we get this really thoughtful, nuanced person. He's very well read and expressive, and he recognizes that in order to survive the world that he's in, he has to pass as less intelligent than he is. He is just a brilliant character. And the way that he relates to Huck Finn in this particular book is really good as well. In the original book, I never really understood the loyalty of Jim to Huck Finn, but in this book, we're given some really compelling reasons that James sticks around and hangs out despite all of the danger around the two of them. This was really good, and honestly, I'm so glad that I read Huck Finn right before I read this. I had heard from many people that you could read James without reading Huck Finn, and it would still be understandable, and that is true. You could read James as a standalone, but I think that reading Huck Finn first actually helps the brilliance of James shine even more clearly. I think it would be a brilliant book either way, but I think that James allows you to see all of the things that Huck Finn is lacking. Fantastic read. From there, we're going to move into some nonfiction, and that's The Underworld, Journeys to the Depths of the Ocean by Susan Casey. So I may be a bit biased in my love of this book because I am a scuba diver. I have about 100 dives in 9 different countries on 4 different continents, and I'm super fascinated by the ocean, by the creatures living in the ocean, and so this topic of journeying to the deepest parts of the world is fascinating to me. This book covers Susan's own journey to some of the deepest, most remote parts of the ocean. Talks about the technology, how to get there, the complexities of navigating these scenarios, what goes into ocean research, the things that they found, how the science on the deepest parts of the ocean has evolved over time. There's just so much interesting information within this book. It is a wealth of knowledge on ocean life. I have heard that Susan Casey's other books on the ocean are also really fantastic, and after having read this one, I'm definitely interested in picking up some of the others. For me, this was just hands down probably one of my favorite nonfictions of the year, but again, I really resonate with the subject, so it may not be quite as interesting to other people. After that, I have Why Fathers Cry at Night, a memoir in love poems, letters, recipes, and remembrances by Kwame Alexander. So this is Kwame Alexander's story told in a very unique format. I love that everything is kind of these short little vignettes about specific moments in his life. He muses on a whole lot of topics, but the ones that stood out to me the most were his relationship with this professor slash mentor and how that shaped his poetry career, his relationship with his wife and soon-to-be ex-wife, both how they fell in love and how they started to fall out of love, and his reflections on fatherhood and his relationship with his children. This was just beautifully written. I love that there were some recipes included in here. I actually really want to try some of these recipes out. In particular, his Nana's hot buttered rolls are in there, and I really want to get to those. This was just a really enjoyable read. It's not a very thick book, as you can see, and all of the stories are told in that short vignette format, so it makes it a really fast read. If you like very poetic description and musings on some very personal topics, I think you'll really enjoy this book. Next up is a book that I feel like is kind of a love it or hate it type book without much middle ground. It's also a book that I feel like I had to kind of sit with and really think about for a while before I could decide on how to read it, and that's Little Rat by Akwaeke Emezi. This book follows a couple in Nigeria, and they go through a breakup, and the man in the couple decides to kind of blow off some steam by going out and partying with some friends. At the party, he witnesses something that he should not have witnessed, and in the process of witnessing it, he interrupts a very powerful man. This leads to a series of very serious repercussions in a scenario where this man is fleeing all of the danger that's following him. The ending of this book had me shook. It made me almost sick to my stomach, and it just leaves you going, damn. Not an easy book at all. Again, check trigger warnings before you read this one. I don't know that the messaging will hit right with everyone. I think that, again, this will be a very polarizing book, and I'm really interested, if you've read it, to hear where you stand on it. Then from there, we're going to pop back over to some nonfiction. We're going to talk about Brave the Wild River by Melissa L. Sevigny. This is a story of the first female botanists to canoe down the river through the Grand Canyon. This was a fascinating read. Again, I love books that feature badass women doing badass things, so I knew from the get-go I was going to enjoy reading this particular book. But I found the whole story actually more interesting than I thought I was going to. So it doesn't just talk about the epic adventure of rafting the Grand Canyon, but all of the media that was following it, the perceptions that were put on these female botanists prior to their adventure, during their adventure, and even after their adventure. I just thought that this captured the time and place so well. It really made you understand the challenges that women of this time period that wanted to be taken seriously as scientists faced. And I also really appreciated all of the challenges they faced in this journey. Canoeing down the river in the Grand Canyon is no easy feat, and this book went into great detail all the obstacles that these women and their team overcame. This book is just a good old-fashioned adventure, but it delves again into the topic of women's rights at the time in a very spectacular way. I really enjoyed my time reading this. This was a fun, fast-paced book that I did not want to put down. If you're looking for a really solid nonfiction that reads like it could be historical fiction, this is the book for you. Next up, I have Master, Slave, Husband, Wife, An Epic Journey from Slavery to Freedom by Ilyon. This is the true story of Ellen and William Craft and their escape from slavery using their ingenuity and their creativity. They escape from slavery, and Ellen, who is able to pass as white, pretends to be a master while her husband William pretends to be a slave. This ruse gets them through all sorts of obstacles that they might not normally be able to pass through, and they eventually make their way to England. The story is remarkable, the journey is remarkable, the obstacles they overcome is remarkable, their relationship is remarkable. This is a very memorable story told in a way that it's super easy to follow, and it goes into so much of what's happening at the time. I really enjoyed this. This was another book that read almost like a thriller instead of a nonfiction. I was at the edge of my seat wondering what was going to happen next. If you're interested in American history, particularly Black American history, I think that this is a fantastic read. And then I have We Were Once a Family by Roxanna Asgarian. So this is the last of my nonfiction reads for the month, and it might be my favorite of them. It is really brutal and really sad, but it's so impeccably researched, so poignant. It says a lot of really crucial and necessary things about society today. This book delves into the foster care system and all of the racial inequality within it. And in particular, it talks about this one specific case where 2 white lesbian women adopted 6 Black children, 3 of which were from one family and 3 of which were from another family. From the moment that these women adopted these children, there were accusations of abuse, neglect, starvation, accusations that the children were completely isolated from their peers, just a lot of really questionable things that were overlooked by the foster care system. Meanwhile, the original birth families of these children were placed under far greater scrutiny, and they had obstacle after obstacle thrown in their way in trying to reunite their families. And in the end, they weren't actually able to reunite their families because these 2 women decided to not only take their own lives, but to take the lives of their 6 adoptive children after they were put under scrutiny from more abuse allegations. This is a heartbreaking, frustrating, maddening, infuriating story that's going to make you want to toss the book across the room. But it's an important story. I think it highlights how kids can be taken away from families for next to nothing. But once they're placed in foster care, that really intense scrutiny that the birth families face, there's none of that for the foster families. They can abuse the system, they can steal the money that is supposed to supplement the care of the children, they can do all sorts of horrific things, and there's very little recourse. Kids, once they're put in the foster care system, have little recourse and little protection. And this story goes even deeper than that because it talks about the racial inequity within the system, how Black families are often put under a much harder scrutiny than white families are, and how the courts and the judges that are presiding over these family courts play into these judgments. This story highlights fault after fault after fault within the system. And honestly, if you're an American citizen, I feel like this is something you absolutely should read. It's something everybody should be aware of, and I don't think it gets talked about enough. And it's not to say that this won't interest people in other countries besides the United States. I just feel that the people here should read it because they have the potential to make changes to the system. They have the potential to write to their congresspeople and their senators and demand justice in these situations. And unfortunately, if the information is not spread and people don't learn about it, then nothing will ever change. So my last 2 5-star reads are both books that I was expecting to be 5-star reads, and I was not disappointed. I'm so glad. So the first of those 2 is Friday Black by Nana Kwame Adjei. So my favorite book of 2023 was Chain Gang All-Stars. I loved Adjei writing, and so I was very excited to delve into his debut short story collection. This book did not disappoint. This is story after story about complex, thematically rich, deep and sad and maddening and frustrating topics. Every single story in this book says something very poignant. There is not one story that doesn't have strong messaging in it. And that's the kind of writing that I like. I like when authors have things to say and they have points to make. And it's really clear that Adichie Brenya has a ton to say. Every single story in this book is incredibly relevant to modern day society. It offers commentary on the way that we process our emotions. It offers commentary on police brutality. It offers commentary on racist court systems. It just offers commentary on so many relevant themes. Again, this is a short read. It's not a hard book to get through in terms of page count, but because it was so deep and complex and sad and so many emotions were being brought up by these stories, I ended up reading it in small chunks throughout the month for my reading sprints. And I feel like that was the best way to do it because it gives you some time to really process what each story is about. Every single story in this book was really good, but the ones that stand out the most to me were the Finkelstein Five, which talks about the unjust killing of Black children and how the court basically gives a pardon to the white killer and the repercussions of that. The Era, which is about our need to constantly feel good. There is an invention of a drug called the Good that everybody takes whenever they're starting to feel a little bit sad or a little bit of turmoil, and how that affects society. I thought that offered a lot of really good commentary on how we use social media today. Zimmerland was another story that really stood out to me. It is about an amusement park where people can go in and see how they react to certain scenarios. So for example, you are put into the role of a neighborhood watchman and there is a Black man walking through your neighborhood and you're given a bunch of different options for how to deal with this particular situation. There's a gun laying there if you want to pick it up and shoot. You have the ability to talk, the ability to fight. There's like a whole, basically you're seeing how you would react. And it turns this into like a theme park experience. It was really haunting, and the way that people react and the way that they commercialize this scenario and the people they target it with that, it said a lot about America, as does all of Adichie Brenya's writing. And my final 5-star read is Tender as the Flesh by Agustina Basterica. So this is one of those books that I was highly anticipating. I found this in a little free library in my trip across the Southwest and I like freaked out. I was so happy to find it. I gobbled this book up. It was my very first read in the month of July and boy, did this hit. This is the same type of book where it says some just really deep and complex things about society. It is packed with thematic exploration. It's a short book. It's a fast read. It's brutal. There are a lot of things that are going to make you feel really squeamish and uncomfortable, but that is the point of this book. The thing that really caught me off guard about this book is that I expected this book to talk about food production and factory farming and the way that we slaughter animals and how inhumane it is. I kind of expected it to be like a vegan manifesto. In a lot of ways it was, but honestly, it went so much deeper than that. This book just hits. And the ending is like a blindside. I don't want to obviously spoil anything because this book deserves you going in without knowing anything about the ending. But let me just say that the ending was the smartest thing that Basterica could have done with this book. I didn't see it coming, but it also made all the sense in the world. This says a lot, and it left me really considering food production afterwards, and really societal structures, the excuses we give when we're doing things wrong. Like, there's a whole lot to unpack with this book. Very theme heavy, very rich. The writing is really good. The translation on this book is superb. I didn't find any narrative issues where you can tell that it was just bad translation. I thought that this flowed really smoothly. And honestly, if I didn't know that this was translated fiction, I would have thought it had been written in English. So that is the end of all of my book reviews for the month of July. As you can see, it was a fantastic reading month. My average rating for the month was so much higher than it usually is. It was a 4.21 stars, which is fantastic. I'm very excited about that. My least favorite book of the month was Lapvona by Otessa Moshfegh. So I don't think that this was technically the worst book in terms of writing. It is, however, the most disappointing book. I really wanted to love this. I was hoping for something really sharp, something subversive, something that made this really great thematic exploration, great critique. I just wanted something that was really gonna make my brain work. And unfortunately, it felt really flat. It was more of a caricature than anything. And I can't really figure out what it was trying to say. I wanted to love this, and I just felt kind of about the whole thing. As for favorite reads, it was so hard to pick a favorite this month, because in any given month, any of my 5-star reads could have been my favorite of the month. But in a month where I had 11 5 stars, it was so hard to pick just one. So I narrowed it down to 3 fiction books and 1 nonfiction book. And I'm sorry, I just can't narrow it down any more than that. The 3 that I picked for fiction are probably all gonna end up in my 24 favorite of 2024. And the 1 nonfiction that I picked will probably end up on my 24 favorite nonfiction of 2024. So, no surprise, but Annie Bot by Sierra Greer. I loved this. Like I said, this said so many deep and thoughtful things about AI, what sentience means, what bodily autonomy means, and the ending just hit. I love when I feel like I got punched in the gut by a book, and this did that. James by Percival Everett. This was fantastic. It took a classic and made it so much more nuanced, so much deeper, so much more thoughtful. This is everything that you want in a classic retelling. This has absolutely converted me to a Percival Everett fan, and I will be hitting his backlist very soon. And Tender as the Flesh by Agustina Basterica. This was another book that was super thought-provoking, super deep, really made me reflect on things, covered a lot of really relevant and important topics. This is another one where the ending was like a punch to the gut. I sat there going like, whoa, wait, what? And I immediately headed over to Instagram and went and discussed the whole ending with a friend of mine who had already read the book, because I just needed somebody to vent to. And she had mentioned it to me. When I mentioned I was reading this, she was like, hey, come find me when you're done. She knew exactly what was going to happen, and it delivered. So those are my 3 favorites. You should definitely read all 3 of them. Hands down, would recommend. I know that a lot of people have concerns with the goriness or brutality of this book. And I will say, yes, there is goriness and brutality in this book, but it is not gratuitous and it is not pointless. I think that it makes a lot of sense with what the book is about and what the book is trying to do. And so I would recommend definitely trying to read it if you're not an overly sensitive reader. Absolutely, definitely pick up these 2. And my favorite nonfiction of the month was We Were Once a Family by Roxanna Asgarian. This is a book that just hits you in the feels. There is no way to read this and not get emotional. It is such a frustrating, sad, infuriating story, and one that should have been preventable. This covers so many topics. It delves into foster care, but it also delves into the inequity within the judicial system and just so many other things. I can't even really adequately explain this book, but if you're into nonfiction, I feel like this is a must read. If you're in the States and you're unaware of what our foster care system is like, this is a must read. And just in general, if you want something that is emotionally impactful and is going to teach you about something that is currently happening, this is a book you should pick up. So that is the end of my July wrap up. As you can see, I had an extraordinary reading month. More books than usual, more highly rated books than usual, a ton of different topics, a ton of different genres, a whole bunch of different authors. I would consider this hands down one of my most successful months, and I'm so happy about it. If you liked the video, hit the thumbs up, comment down below, and let me know how July was for you. What did you read? What was your favorite, your least favorite? How many books did you get to? Whatever you want to tell me about your reading month. And if you're not already subscribed to my channel, you know what to do. Hit the subscribe button down below, as well as the notification bell, so that you never miss a video, and that way we can see each other again soon. Thanks so much for joining. Bye.